Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Having sat down and interviewed so many high-profile authors and cultural figures yourself, what can you take from that when it's now you on the other end of the mic, by the way?
It's easier for me and harder for you.
Is it?
I think so.
Why is that?
'Cause I will follow where you want to go.
I see. Then I guess I'll just get into it. It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking today, coming to you from Echo Park, talking to Carolyn Kellogg, who writes about books and publishing for the Los Angeles Times. You might also know her from a blog and a podcast she had called Pinky's Paper House, or her internet radio show before that. When I say internet radio, how should I describe that first venture? Internet radio doesn't mean the same thing it used to, I don't think.
Well, in the 90s, there was a pirate radio station in Silver Lake called KBLT, and I was one of the DJs on that. I just had a regular DJ show. Some of the DJs on that show were very political, and during the 2000 convention, set up a pirate radio station as a way to communicate for activists who were protesting downtown. Those people then took their radio venture online and actually set up an internet radio show or internet radio station that functioned like a college radio station. Some shows were overtly political, some were musical, and when I came along, I mixed books and culture, so people could tune in live. It wasn't like, I guess currently there's things like Spotify where people create their own musical radio stations, but it was basically like a broadcast radio station that you could listen to online.
There's something I once heard you say in an interview about that internet radio show, the books and culture show you did, which was that it gave you an excuse to get into the Los Angeles literary scene without just having to go up to people and not have not have a reason, not have an excuse, not have a pretense to talk to people in that scene. Is that true?
Yeah, I have no social skills, so having the veil of a microphone around which I could frame conversation was a way to get involved. And I was really curious who was writing in Los Angeles and what they were all about, so I asked them to come on the show and play music that they liked.
So in those early days, what did you discover about what the Los Angeles literary world was?
Well, it was really interesting because I think that, like, people have this what I think is a false idea of Los Angeles as a fractured city. At the time, the literary culture was fractured. It didn't feel like there were a lot of pieces connecting it. So it was almost like filaments in an Etch-a-Sketch waiting for a magnet. And I certainly wasn't that magnet, but I was one of a couple of magnets that started dragging around. And blogging, I think, really became a couple of major loci around which the LA literary community started to cohere. And there were lots of things, like through blogging, myself and two other people who had been to graduate school didn't go to a writing conference one year, so we held an anti-version of the writing conference for everybody who was stuck in Los Angeles, and it was a totally random, broad, brilliant assemblage of people who came. And since I've come back to Los Angeles in 2008, I went to graduate school, I went away and I came back. I have seen the literary scene cohere quite a bit, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, which is an independent entity, has done a lot to help bring people together.
Now, does it make sense to talk about the character of a Los Angeles literary scene, or is it purely geographical, like, well, this is a literary scene, it just happens to be here? Is there some characteristic that it has other than being here, I guess is what I want to ask?
That's an interesting question. I think that when we think about Los Angeles writing, people tend to think of classic mystery fiction, like stuff written by Raymond Chandler, James N. Cain's work that he wrote when he was here, and then the biggest sort of heir to that literary tradition would be James Ellroy, who is part of Los Angeles literature, but, you don't see him out at bars anymore because he gave that up a long time ago. So I think in some ways the Los Angeles literary scene is a lot like that in New York. There are a number of people who are writing literary fiction. There are poets who sort of act in sort of a separate poetry sphere. There are bits and pieces that are separated geographically, like the people that go to the readings on the west side don't come over to readings on the east side quite as much. There's people trying to do things in Lincoln Heights. There's people doing stuff in Mid-City. If there's anything that distinguishes the Los Angeles literary scene from, say, the New York literary scene, it's that we're nicer.
Nicer?
That's what everybody says.
What explanation could there be for that?
I think because publishing is the hometown business in New York, there's a tremendous feeling of competition, and it's really, I think, the kind of competition that maybe actors feel or people working in television feel here in Los Angeles, people who are in books are free of. So in New York, people really eat themselves up over how much somebody got for their next book deal. And here there's less of that, just because it's not in your face all the time.
There's some advantage to it being, I don't want to say having less primacy in the Los Angeles culture, but there's a few things that have extreme primacy that lightning rod away all that anxiety, perhaps?
Perhaps, or because the place where that anxiety is resting is over in Manhattan. Yeah, we're a little immune from it, perhaps.
Now, listeners will know you from Jacket Copy, the Los Angeles Times blog about publishing and books. You post there quite often. Tell me a little bit about what kind of balance you want to strike, or they want you to strike, between posts on the world of books that is stateless, that is everywhere, and the one we find right here in Los Angeles.
I like to think of Los Angeles as being stateless. I think when you start to think of, I don't know, there's a couple of different aspects. I'd like to think of Los Angeles literature as just literature. But like you said, there's a different community. Like, this place is a place where there are readings, and there are places on the west side where the readings would have a very different character. I have a brand new editor who started last week. So discussing that balance and exploring the local culture in ways that are fresh and new and engaging is something we're talking about. But, after 5 days on the job, I don't expect her to have everything figured out.
But still, she's got ideas. Well, what would be, obviously, there will be no spilling of the new editor's vision here, but what would count as a fresh way?
I don't know. I think mostly the onus is on me to come up with it. But I also think that I sort of have to think aloud here for a second. So forgive me. For example, we were talking about something today, and that was an idea was to talk to Los Angeles authors about, like, their favorite place to read, their favorite place to buy books, their favorite place to work when they're writing, when they're not at home. In some ways, that feels pretty expected to me, and trying to come up with a different angle on how writers inhabit the city is, I have this other plan up my sleeve, and I just have to sell it to her.
How they inhabit it, meaning what?
Not asking them to construct a series of favorites or special places, but finding a way into, like their Trader Joe's, or, tagging along with them when they're trying to find a parking space at their apartment, which is probably not the most exciting idea, but Los Angeles is a city that functions. A lot of what you do is about the urbanness of this place and other places, right? Los Angeles is a city that functions in particular and specific ways. And I think that can't help but inform the people who live and work here. And so trying to connect to that in a way that's not a construct that feels like a magazine piece is something I'm interested in.
It sounds like you've been able to identify already, or you happen to have seen that people who live here, be they authors, cultural figures, whomever, I would guess, based on what you've said, that you have observed them all using this city quite differently. There's not going to be an identical story like this about any two authors, is there?
I know someone who is working on a nonfiction book, and they told me what the book was about. It's about walking. And I said, you can't walk in your neighborhood. And the response was, I walk in my neighborhood all the time, but it's a neighborhood that isn't known for being a walking neighborhood. And so, yes, I think authors do. I mean, I think of my neighborhood, Echo Park, as a place where you can walk, not mid-city. There's nothing in mid-city. Why would you walk around mid-city? But apparently people do.
It is one of those questions you hear a lot about various neighborhoods. Somebody will say where they live and what they do there, and saying you can't do that there. I mean, I've heard that about more than walking. Like, I didn't know you could do that thing essential in life in that part of Los Angeles as well. I mean, you've heard these conversations go on, right? What's going on with that? The fact that certain neighborhoods seem like terra incognita and maybe not even life supporting in a certain sense until you talk to somebody who lives there.
I think because Los Angeles, in its breadth and space, is ultimately, unknowable. Anybody who claims to know the city is being kind of facetious, perhaps. Like even Jonathan Gold, who spends his whole life going back and forth across the city eating. He can't eat his way all the way across it. So we have to build up little ideas about places because we can't get to all of them, maybe. For example, everybody likes to think, it's easier to move through the world if you rely on stereotypes, right? So everybody thinks that all bookstores are closing, that bookstores are dying, all bookstores are closing. But in fact, there's 2 new bookstores opening up in this calendar year across the street from each other in Highland Park, which if you told people a generation older than me, they would say, but nobody reads in Highland Park.
Why did they think that?
Because Highland Park used to be a slightly rough neighborhood, but, it hasn't been a rough neighborhood for a long time.
Right. We're sitting at a bookstore now, of course, and I know you've written about another bookstore people seem to like a whole lot. I certainly do. The Last Bookstore in downtown Los Angeles, which is like 10,000 square feet, isn't it? It's enormous, and it's the kind of thing that you read often, stories about how something like that will never exist again. And it is fascinating because, I don't know, as somebody who reads a lot of books and a lot of book coverage, often I read so many stories about how, well, there's not going to be any bookstores, there aren't going to be any more books, and people won't be reading anymore. Like, there's all these stories about various crises with the books and publishing, but I feel like I don't sense a problem on the ground. Like, I still go to bookstores often and read often, and there's too many good books, not too few to get to. So what's the story there?
Well, I think that there are definitely people. The thing is, if you go to your local bookstore, Skylight, Book Soup, Diesel Books, if you go to your local bookstore, you're not seeing the person standing in the bookstore who's staying at home reading their Kindle and buying their ebooks via WhisperNet. You're not seeing them. You're in a totally different community. And there definitely are people who have converted. I have people who try to convince me to convert and become someone who will only read ebooks. But for example, you've got a piece of equipment here that I think is a digital recorder. Mm-hmm. So it's a digital recorder, and you're recording ephemerally, essentially. Before this, Hunter S. Thompson carried around a tape recorder, a reel-to-reel tape recorder. That was actually a solid format. Books are a solid format. If you drop this digital recorder in the toilet, you're in trouble.
I keep it away from there.
I feel much better now. You can't drop your library in the toilet. You can drop a Kindle in the toilet. You can your Kindle can slide off a desk and crash, and you can lose your. Maybe you've paid to have your library stay offline. But ebooks, the book itself, the book on paper, is a 600-year-old format that's very stable. And like you said, unless somebody goes around burning them all up, there will be too many of them for any human being to ever read even a tiny fraction of. So there's plenty to read and plenty of people who still like the form.
So why the hand-wringing then? I mean, does it make a nice scary headline? I don't know what the source of the actual distress is. There's got no smoke without fire.
Well, first of all, when you bring up the Last Bookstore, which is a beautiful space, it's not selling new books. It's not putting any money into the publishing ecosystem. So there's been a couple of different pressures on publishing. One is that publishing used to be sort of a gentleman's business, where it was enough for a publishing house like Knopf or Grove to get to the end of the year, have paid all its bills, have enough money to run for another year. It was profit margins were 1% to 3%. Under conglomeration and corporatization, those aren't acceptable profit margins, and quarterly reports don't behoove a gentleman's industry. So one of the crises in publishing is actually trying to force a business into a model that may not suit it particularly well. A second crisis is from that kind of pressure. The same pressures were brought to bear on the music industry, and it's not the digitization of the materials as much as it is in a creative industry. It's a company's health is built on being able to have lots of failures. Every project is a risk. Nothing is a sure bet. So in the old music industry, like Neil Young could put out record after record, and maybe he'd have one blockbuster hit, and maybe he'd have a couple of things that were okay, and then the record company would put out, Space Hog, and it would sink. Or, like, for every one successful record, there's hundreds, thousands that aren't successful. For every one girl with a dragon tattoo, there's 100, 200 books that barely make back their advance, barely cover the costs of the designers, and there's some that never make that money back. A lot of books that are published that you've heard of, that get good press, that have really good authors behind them, will never earn out their advances, even if the advances were modest. Trying to make a business that is inherently built on creative risk fit into a corporate model like that, it changes the nature of the business, and publishing has gone the way of the music industry in some directions, where the big companies spend more and more money to try to come up with big hits, like spending a lot of money on a new Betty White memoir, or Penny Marshall is going to write a memoir, and everybody who remembers Laverne and Shirley is supposed to buy it. Instead of finding the next person who's going to be the new Jennifer Egan, or someone who's going to take risks with form and who nobody's really heard of quite yet.
So these are the constraints that a large publisher works under, but what about the smaller ones? Does this mean the creative advantage goes to them?
Yes, I think so. And I think particularly with the challenges that are brought about by ebooks, whereas, the big publishers are like those big cruise ships trying to turn around, and you've got Akashic is on a little jet ski saying we can publish Go the Fuck to Sleep and make more money off that than any of our other books so far. Shoom, shoom. So I think the creative advantage does go to them. It's just a question of being able to find capital. And I think it's really interesting that some publishing ventures have found success with places like Kickstarter, trying to do something new, and people who like books want to see it, so they'll throw money at it.
Given that you're writing about books all the time, and which makes you have to think about books all the time, presumably, has anything changed in terms of what's crossing your own personal radar screen? I mean, the books that become available to you, that you learn about, that you read, does the selection feel different these days, in the supposed crisis days, than it did ever before to you?
I think I've only been around in the crisis. Like, when I started, the blogs were the crisis in criticism, but I was a blogger. So I was trying to bring about an end to publishing, and I failed. Now I'm part of the system.
Can't beat them, join them.
I've only been around in the crisis mode, but publishing likes to sort of exist, maybe because books are so boring. I think books are brilliant, but the crisis before that was, earlier it was big box stores squeezing out independence, and after big box stores squeezing out independence, it was Amazon, and after Amazon it was ebooks, and really the challenges posed to the publishing industry itself by Amazon in some ways are far greater than the evolution of technology that's coming from ebooks.
I do hear them wind up with most of the blame. People, at the end of the day, they will stop talking about the devices or the ebooks, and they'll say, well, but Amazon, look at it. Just look at it. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to, right?
Well, you'd have to tell me who said that. Who said that?
Oh, geez, actually stay away from these have they stopped? I mean, it's a serious question. I used to hear in every conversation that I would listen in on among friends, or if I was talking to an author, they would, or a bookseller, they would eventually get down to, well, Amazon's causing a lot of the problem. But now that you mention that, I mean, I haven't been listening in on those specific conversations. Has it really? Have they changed? Or is Amazon not the bad guy talked about much anymore?
There's a number of hot issues in publishing right now that have to do with the Google Books scanning, the Google Book settlement, Amazon pricing, and ebook pricing at the iBookstore. All those things end up getting knotted into this one. It's really hard to sort of pull those pieces apart, and it's probably incredibly boring. But Amazon is part of the Amazon. Yeah, I can't even try. I can't even pull it apart. It would just be too boring.
Because you are on the board of the National Book Critics Circle, I just have to ask about this that you mentioned. You know, the crisis and criticism days of blogging. I mean, I haven't heard the words crisis and criticism for a while. Is that blown over?
That's blown over. It took a new form a few weeks ago when Jacob Silverman wrote a post on his Tumblr that then Slate asked him to blow up into a normal piece that was, the new crisis is Twitter is making everybody too nice. This is Jacob Silverman, who now lives in New York but lived here for a while, made the case that Twitter has become a land of boosters and Yahooers and Wooters, and that criticism had therefore died an ignoble death. The case was, and so there was some blowback and some conversation around it. It's kind of hard to engage in genuine criticism in 140 characters at a time. There's not a lot of room for nuance. And so most of the critics that I know that are on Twitter are talking about publishing and about things that they're reading, but aren't trying to use it as a forum for criticism.
But because Twitter is short form, does that necessarily mean anything else for the existing forms of criticism? I mean, it seems like that argument that you've described is premised on because Twitter exists, everything pre-Twitter is somehow tainted by it? I mean, maybe I don't quite understand that.
Silverman pointed to a couple of figures on Twitter as examples of people who are boosters and non-critical. His primary example is someone who's incredibly sweet and is an author and a bookseller. So her job is to be a booster. She's a bookseller. So it didn't really make a lot of sense. But I do think that Twitter existing has created a different kind of a dialogue around books, but I think it's a really broad dialogue. The LA Times Books Twitter feed, not my personal one, but the LA Times Books Twitter feed has more than 100,000 followers. I don't know who any of those people are. None of us ever talk to them. They just are really nice because they're curious about books and they want to read the headlines and click through and read reviews and read stories about authors.
Is it illegitimate? It's not because this whole divide between criticism and recommending things you like. I mean, if you're boosting everything, no matter if you think it's genuinely good or worthwhile, that's one thing. But to boost things, but to selectively boost things, it's not criticism, but it's not a bad thing either, is it?
No, and most of I think that most book critics that I know would. And not all of them are on Twitter, but most book critics that I know, if they're expressing an opinion about a book and they're going to say something negative about a novel or a biography or a history, they need to be able to back that up with examples from the text. Like if you want to say that writing is bad, you need more than 140 characters to show, a couple of sentences of bad writing. If you want to take issue with a historical take, like there was recently a Thomas Jefferson history that was written by a conservative thinker who even conservatives said was too inaccurate. Like he said that Jefferson never had sex with his slaves. although he fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings. And the book got pulled by its Christian publisher and is now going to be republished by Glenn Beck. But like even the people who agreed with this guy generally were fellow evangelicals, said that his history was inaccurate. But it took them way more than 140 characters. If you're gonna take down a book, you're not just going to say, what are you going to do? Go on Twitter and say book bad? You don't have much more room than that. So it's great that on Twitter there's a place to say book good for books that are good if you don't need to give any further discussion.
How many forms do you work in when you talk about books? You do tweet, you do work in the sort of short form, the blog form on Jacket Copy, and longer still writing about books for the Times. How does it get sliced up in your mind, or what are the levels here, the formal levels of writing about books that you do?
I suppose if I say it's all just one nightmare of way too much work that I never get done, that's not slicing it up. That's not a very sophisticated answer. I'm on Twitter a lot because for me it's like it's like passing notes in class. Blogging is like raising my hand in class and talking to the teacher, and I'm just making this up as I go along. And writing a review is like doing a paper. There are so many different ways to communicate online now. Like, should we go on Pinterest? Like, what should I do on Pinterest? Should I have a Tumblr? Why do I let it die? Why don't I update my website?
Do you know what to do on Pinterest, by the way? I still haven't looked into that, but maybe you have the answer as to what that's best suited for.
I am trying to figure out if there's any way that it's suited to books. So far, it doesn't... I haven't found a large reading community there. There's a couple of people. I like looking at the pretty pictures that other people put up.
What makes a piece of the internet suited to books? What do you think makes one type of social network excellent for talking about books and another worthless for that?
I think the internet overall is very suited to readers, and it's really interesting. The NEA about 7 years ago now did a report called Reading at Risk, and it was a big thing about how nobody was reading anymore and young people weren't reading anymore, and they didn't count the internet in any of their numbers. And I was like, what? And they were saying, people spend all this time on their computers, and I'm like, yeah, they're looking at words, we call it reading. And then 4 or 5 years later, when the director of the NEA was when he was towards the end of his tenure, they did a report that was like reading revived, and it was like, everybody's reading now, and they had suddenly started counting the internet.
It's okay, never mind, we're good.
It's like,
just keep rolling on.
We had these initiatives, we fixed the problem. But counting the internet as people on the internet who read books as readers actually helped, anyway. So as for social networks, I think it's very organic, and I think that part of it becomes critical mass, like you go where the other people go that are having the discussion that you want to be a part of. So there needs to be a core group that's interesting, engaged, and, lively and active. I think any time that that institutions start to inhabit a social networking space and try to use it for their own devices, and I say this as a member of an institution, that's when things start to go downhill, because they don't understand that it's about institutions don't understand conversation versus promotion, and now they pay consultants a lot to tell them how to do it.
As an institution, though, the Los Angeles Times does seem to have a reasonably good understanding, from what I can tell. And given you mentioned the follower count of even just that one account, I mean, the usage of the web, at least on the part of the Los Angeles Times, seems to understand what the web is. No.
Well, we have some good people who work for us.
That's where we can let it lay.
Yeah, I mean, the Los Angeles Times has the breadth of blogs that it does because it brought on the former editor of LAist, Tony Pierce, to run blogs, and it's consolidated a lot of the blogs that he started, which is too bad because Tony's really, really smart and really energetic and so committed to Los Angeles. Like, he at LAist did a neighborhood project to define neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And do you know, I mean, you probably know this, that the specific physical geographic boundaries of places like Filipino Town or Echo Park are really undefined and overlap and messed up. Even Angelino Heights on one side of town, Angelino is spelled with an E, and on the other, like around the block, it's spelled with an I. Like the big blue sign, like they can't even agree. And Silver Lake, there was the big debate: is it Silver Lake one word or Silver Lake two words?
I hesitate every time when I type it.
Well, actually, there's signs that say both, like official City of Los Angeles signs that say both. So Tony set about mapping out the city, partly by sending people who were blogging for him out to their neighborhoods to figure out what those things were, but also like going and checking the papers. And now he's at KPCC and is doing a similar thing. So the Times has brought in some great people to do work there.
And indeed, listeners, if you haven't heard, Tony Pierce was on this show a few months back, and you can go back and look it up and hear a little bit more about that and more. He has a lot to say. But yes, smart, energetic fellow, you're completely right. And you as well put some time in at LAist. I mean, what can you say about the relationship of that site to Los Angeles?
Oh, God, that was the best thing ever. I mean, like, now my job is the best thing ever, but at the time, again, like, being someone asking questions and being a journalist of a sort was a way for me to explore the city in different ways and to ask questions about it, like to go to the press conference with Frank Gehry about what they were going to do with the Grand Avenue project. You know, like, it was so interesting to go to Koreatown and take a picture of a poster on a wall that all the text is in Korean, and then put on the blog, who's this guy and what office is he running for, and have people answer. The Los Angeles Times, in one way, is such a big institution that it has a hard time getting down into the nooks and crannies of the city, and it's lost, you know, so much staff since I was at LAist that it's almost impossible. But bloggers are like tell those stories in LAist. The idea of a metro blog, LAist, Blogging LA, and now places like, you know, like Curbed and Apartment Therapy. East Side or LA, like, blogs can tell those micro stories in a way that that I think is what you want.
You mentioned being away for a few years for graduate school. I want to clarify this before we go on any further. How far does your history with Los Angeles go back?
But if I tell you that, then you'll know that I'm really, really old.
That really, really old is a subjective label.
I moved to Los Angeles in the 80s to go to college. And I dropped out of college after a year and a half. I dropped out of USC after a year and a half. And started working downtown. So I worked at Gorky's downtown, which was it was an all-night Russian-themed cafe that was one of the few things that you could go to downtown that wouldn't get you killed.
I was going to say there was a different era for downtown, as I understand it.
Very much. There was Gorky's, there was Lace, and there was Al's Bar, and really that was it. And when you went to Al's Bar, you had to pay a homeless person to guard your car, which just was a bribe for not having your car broken into.
Sure, protection money. What was your relationship to the place then? I mean, I assume it's changed vastly since the days of paying homeless people to not key your car, break into it. But tell me a little bit about how you think differently about Los Angeles now than then, or if you do, or if I'm wrong about that.
Well, I really love Los Angeles. Like, and by the way, I did actually go back to college and eventually go to graduate school. Sure. But back then, when I got my first car, which I bought my old roommate's Pinto off of her.
Legendary automobile.
And eventually it didn't have reverse. I was supposed to pay a number of parking tickets that came with the car, and then I didn't because I was a bad young woman. I would take her car and I would drive out on the freeways and then just take an exit that I didn't know and then try to make my way home on surface streets. because I always thought the city was fascinating, and I didn't think I was going to figure it out by following other people's directions to go to major places. And so, I mean, I get lost. I still get lost in parts of Studio City, but I'm really curious about the texture of the city. And but for the most part, I've stayed living east of La Brea, east of Normandy. I lived for 6 months in Palms, and I thought I was going to kill myself.
So the grand east side, west side divide, when that issue comes up, you certainly know which side you're on.
Listen, if I had $100 million, I would live in Malibu, and a driver, I would live in Malibu too. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful, and I don't begrudge anyone who manages to afford seafront property in Southern California. Short of that, I don't really want to live in a shitty apartment building that's only 8 feet away from another shitty apartment building where I can hear somebody beating their kid. I just don't want to do it.
Right. I don't think anybody would really blame you for that.
But I don't think, I don't like to think of there being an east side, west side divide. I just think it takes a lot of time to get across town.
That it does. Now, with all the ways people sort of grapple with understanding this place, I mean, tell me about how viable books and literature are as a lens through which to view Los Angeles.
I think they're the best lens because
sure, go on.
Because books are able to go beyond the literal and to talk about ideas. And I think when you talk about a city like Los Angeles, which has so many dimensions, going beyond the literal is really important. So there's this movie, Los Angeles Plays Itself, which takes clips from films that were shot in Los Angeles and puts them together to create a narrative of Los Angeles as a physical space. But I think it falls short. It's too physical and too literal. Like, I prefer watching old episodes of Rockford Files because they shot on the streets, and nobody shot on the streets in the 70s in Los Angeles because it was kind of like it was an empty space. Like, architecturally, people didn't think there was anything interesting going on. So it's like a part of Los Angeles history that's like sort of visually not chronicled, yet in literature you've got, I guess Joan Didion had moved away by then. I think trying to describe Los Angeles as a city visually is less interesting than the incidental Los Angeles visually as a city. But the people that write about Los Angeles as a physical space and how we inhabit that space and what that means can be really interesting. You've got, on the narrative nonfiction side, you've got Joan Didion, and then you've got all this great urban theory that you know all the names of, and I don't need to list for you.
Sure, I'll say I know the names of them all, and we won't get any further into it. The getting past the literal, sometimes it feels like it takes an outsider to do that. The farther away from Los Angeles they're from, the more they can do it. I don't always believe that, but is that a sense you've had as well?
It depends on the person. I mean, I think that someone like in the 20s and the 30s and 40s, when there were writers coming here from New York to try to make money in Hollywood, like Nathaniel West, say. Nathaniel West had been working, who wrote Day of the Locust and Miss Lonely Hearts. He had apparently been working as the guy who answered the phones in a hotel in New York. Like, he was the desk man at a New York hotel. So he came here, he didn't have a ton of money, and he sort of tapped into a kind of existential zeitgeist of people not reaching their dreams in Los Angeles that I think was really in the moment, but he wasn't from here. But I think part of that was that there were a lot of internal immigrants to Los Angeles at the time. Faulkner was here at the same time, and he just picked up and left. There's, you've heard that legend, right? Have you heard this?
I think I have.
Then I won't repeat it.
It's not for me.
Okay, well, so there's this legend that William Faulkner went into the studio that he was writing for, and the producer studio head said, "Oh, I don't like this draft. You're going to have to go back home. You're going to have to go and write me a new draft. And Faulkner said, okay, I'm going to go home and work on a new draft. And the studio head said, okay, see you later. And Faulkner turned on his heel and went all the way back to Mississippi and left his Hollywood apartment behind.
It did seem to get under the skins of a lot of those types, didn't it?
Well, I think they're such icons of American literature. I mean, Fitzgerald came here and died here. And Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Nathaniel West, James M. Cain, Raymond Chandler, they all came here from someplace else. And Fitzgerald died, Faulkner left, Nathaniel West died on his way to Fitzgerald's funeral in a car wreck. It took a bite out of some of them. Chandler, had to depart down south to the beach. It may just be that they're the people that we look to because they're such great writers. Like they're great writers and they're great American writers. So we like to look to their experience in Los Angeles as somehow describing how the city can affect us. That's a really terrible answer. I'm sorry.
It's not a terrible answer, but I wonder, the writers who work here today, they seem to thrive a little better. I mean, they don't seem to hate the place as much, do they? Or maybe you know different.
It's interesting. I really love Raymond Chandler, not just because I share my birthday with him, but I really love his writing, and I really love his take on the city. And I think in some ways you could describe it as being hate. But I think it's more like someone who's had his heart broken by something that he truly loved. And I think that feeling of Los Angeles as being something that you love and that will ultimately betray you maybe is something that is endemic to the city. I'm not sure. But I think I sense that as a theme.
Is that something you sense from the city directly? It's a place you love but will ultimately betray you personally. Do you feel that?
I think in some ways, if you look at the way the city physically rewrites itself, like Norman Klein's work, the way that you can go back over a block and it's not there. Steve Erickson has written about how the house that he grew up in, post-World War II, disappeared for a freeway extension. So there was a whole community and a whole neighborhood, and it was like one of those neighborhoods that was settled and suburban and seemed like it would be there for generations, and it was there for like 25 years, and now it doesn't even exist. It was wiped off the face of the planet. I think because we have had infinite expansion and we keep, we sprawl hits the wall, maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, folds back on itself. We keep rewriting the physical space of Los Angeles more than cities that are older and more confined, like New York. That sense of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles that you knew disappearing, I think is maybe more present than in another place like New York.
You can watch it disappear almost before your eyes. It's not like you came back a generation later. Things are gone more quickly here.
Something deeper, I think, than just urban reinvention or urban. What do we call it?
I used to call it urban renewal, but that's not the term these days anymore. But things are changing. We can say that.
Something more than just storefronts coming to life. Something deeper than that. And I think it's the same kind of thing that people who've been in parts of New York, like Williamsburg, where crappy 4-story walk-ups have been replaced by these like grand walls of glass, I think they maybe get a little bit of a sense of it. There's
a challenge you do face that would happen wherever you were doing this work, which is I believe I've heard you say the 5 and 25 books a day that come to you, and you have to filter through these. Is that still correct?
Yeah, more than that. I live in a fourplex, and one night this week, I came home from work, and there was a pile of books in front of my door, like there always is, but probably 15 books in the pile, and I was like, oh, okay, it's a 15-book pile, it's not too bad. And my neighbor had one of those boxes from the post office in front of...
Plastic, like clear things, oh.
Had a box that was full in front of his door. And I said, oh, that's funny. He doesn't usually get that much mail. And then I looked, and it was actually all for me. So yes, lots of books come, and it's one of the things that makes me think there's not a crisis in publishing. There may be lots of self-publishers, there may be lots of books that I'm never going to read, but there's lots and lots and lots and lots of books.
But the process of filtering, it always fascinates me about books because there's so many, and there's so many ones not worth your attention, but so many ones that are. There's the filtering of actually going through a pile of books at your doorstep, but there's the filtering that comes from talking to people or from doing literary things in the real world or from being on the internet, whether it's Twitter, blogs. I mean, what are the filters that really work well for you?
Well, I don't take anybody else's word for it. I look at everything. Sometimes looking at something is super cursory, like if it's got a picture of a werewolf and a 14-year-old girl sort of like mooning at him, chances are it's not a book that I'm interested in. Although, maybe it's a satire, maybe it's a really good werewolf mooning book. I don't know.
There's always that little maybe, like, well, it could be.
I mean, I really do. I look at everything that comes to me. The hardest thing is, well, it's sort of easy for me to come up with like a yeah, this isn't for me pile, and easy for me to come up with a yes, I definitely, like, oh, it's a new book by Jeffrey Eugenides. I love him. I've read everything he's written. I can't wait to take a look at that. That's a yes. It's the maybe pile that's really hard. When I was, when I wrote about music, the maybe pile was the hardest for me.
It's even beyond the stuff that gets sent to you that you physically have. I mean, it doesn't all come to your doorstep, right? There's plenty in the book world that you still have to sift through, still have to figure out the importance of, even if it's not being shipped right to you, correct?
Well, between what comes to me at home and what comes to me at the office and what comes to other people at the office, I've got access to pretty much everything that I want. But you're right. Some publishers, like McSweeney's, doesn't actually send out advance copies. So I was in the book room and I was like, oh my God, there's a new book by Dave Eggers. I really want to read this. And that was how I ended up reviewing A Hologram for the King, because they weren't sending out press releases. They weren't. So sometimes you have to chase stuff down.
I don't want to use too broad a term for what I'm going to ask about, but I want to know what currents in literature you're watching most closely. I mean, what developments, what I don't know if there's any movements anymore, but what draws your attention? What makes you think this is what I'm going to have to focus on next in books?
Well, I love literary fiction, so I will never leave that behind. And this fall is particularly exciting because, there's books by Zadie Smith, Michael Chabon, Junot Diaz. I'm missing some. There's just like a number of Pulitzer Prize winners, all piling on top of each other at the same time. There's a lot of great stuff coming out. For me, one of the most interesting things is The Atavist, which is one of these long-form nonfiction, electronic-only publications. And the reason that I find it so interesting is because it's built for a tablet, although you can read it on other electronic devices. And it incorporates multimedia in a way that is sincere and genuine to the narrative and native to the narrative. And Evan Ratliff, who's the founder and sort of editor, although I think they just hired a managing editor. Evan Ratliff is that guy who went missing for Wired, the guy who tried to go offline and he had to check in, and some billionaire from Seattle paid enough people to help him chase him down. So he's a guy who really has known about new technologies and playing with new technologies. So when he showed me the first Atavist piece, which he had written, the opening paragraph wasn't a paragraph. It was a clip of a bank heist. And it was a story about this bank heist somewhere in the Netherlands, and it was all these security cameras, and it was the security camera footage of these people who basically landed a helicopter on top of a building and then broke in and took all this gold out of some bank and then took off with it. So if it was in the New Yorker, he would have described that, narratively. Then they landed the helicopter. Then they did this. Then they did that. But because it wasn't in the New Yorker, because he was able to use the tablet as a form, he just used that as the lead, the video as the lead, and then he went into describing the why of the story and the what made the story interesting. And he didn't say, let me tell you what you just saw. I think too many people, when they look at multimedia that have come from a text background, like a writing background, are like, oh, and then here we'll click to it. Like, here's all those little pieces, video, audio, that those become like add-ons, like links that are separate as opposed to embedded in the narrative. And I think The Atavist, which has done more than any other of these new online forums to try to actually incorporate those into storytelling in a way that's really smart. And they created a back-end system, which is their own publishing system, which they have just started to share. I mean, like, maybe it's only in beta that they're sharing it. So The Atavist has this CMS that they were selling and that they got financing for, and I think now people can use it. So the first thing I thought when I saw it was, oh, I want to play with that. Like, I want to tell stories where I can use that. And every time that they have written one of these pieces, their pieces are always really interesting and use multimedia in interesting ways. And I think a lot of people want to, in the conversations that I've had, sometimes people want to take that and turn it into, this is the end of the book. It's all just the internet. It's all just ebooks. It's all just like going out into the universe, and it's all going to be digitized and books don't exist anymore. I think the question of what makes a book becomes all the more interesting when a book can be infinite. Like, how do you define story, and how do you tell a story in an interesting way?
And purely as a reader, there's not many satisfactory moments, or there haven't been many satisfactory moments for that. There have been a lot of bad experiments with multimedia, not bad, but maybe failed in terms of the reader's experience. This time it sounds like someone's getting it right.
I think so. And I think that there's plenty of people who are trying to get it right. And I think there's a lot to be played with. So for me, that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
And finally, I've got to ask this: do you think it's necessary? I mean, really, when it comes down to it, is there? I have moments where I think, well, they've kind of. It seems like the book got it right. We certainly seem to have a lot of conversations these days about what's going to replace it, or what, or how it's going to disappear, or if it's not going to, or if it is going to, or how to augment it or to reinvent it. There are moments where it seems like that might not be necessary, aren't there?
I think that whatever kind of ebook evolution there is, that people say, and I think perhaps with some validity, that what it's cannibalizing out of the book business is trade paperbacks. That people care about having the book as an object will be attracted to the hardcover, and to a hardcover that's particularly beautiful, with a cover designed by Chip Kidd and with deckled edges, and that beautiful objects are going to be the high end, and that the lower end, the mass market paperbacks that used to be like a lot of romance and a lot of the like sort of pulpier mysteries or cheesier mysteries, that's where ebooks will cannibalize. And that seems to be the case by the numbers. But I would like to think that any new form will actually expand the base of readers and expand the base of people who are engaging with books, and that people who like the old forms will just keep, reading books in whatever form they like them. But it's true that, like, Harlequin has done really well with ebooks.
Where Harlequin goes, so goes much of the industry, I think. This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I have been Colin Marshall. Been speaking with Carolyn Kellogg, who writes about the publishing industry, writes about books, writes so much on the Jacket Copy blog for the Los Angeles Times. She is formerly of Pinky's Paper House, the podcast and the blog, and she sits on the board of the National Book Critics Circle. Carolyn, thanks so much again for taking the time today.
Thank you.
You can keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.